Здравствуйте and добрый вечер. That's my limited Russian. I actually used to study Russian. I'm so thrilled and honored to be working with you all in our workshop today. So thank you for coming. I hope that the topics that we discuss are interesting and relevant and useful for you. So we will be focusing in this workshop on identifying disciplinary preferences in writing, and we're going to focus on academic research writing. Let me give you an overview of how we will run the workshop and the topics that we'll discuss. So we'll start with just some general introductions. I'd like to introduce myself to you. I will also introduce what we mean by disciplinary variation in academic writing. And then we are going to dive in a little deeper to a few areas where we see disciplinary preferences in research writing. And I want to just start by kind of giving a caution that we can't review all disciplinary preferences for writing features in the time that we have today. So what I hope to do instead is offer you some tools for thinking about variation in academic research writing and thinking about how to explore that variation in your own discipline. So we'll give you some strategies that you can take forward, I hope. My research area is in second language writing and in academic writing. So I love looking at how people write and also how they learn to write. I also publish and research in this area. So I do have publishing experience as well. So like you, I write a lot and I go through the publishing and reviewing and editing process, which I know can be challenging and daunting. But I understand the experience firsthand. I also worked as an editor for an international journal for 6 years, which was very, very helpful for me as a writer to understand the other side of publishing. And so I hope to bring some of that perspective as well. Okay, I'd like to know a little bit more about all of you. And so we have some polls, and also we'll use the Zoom chat so that I can just learn a little bit about the backgrounds that you're bringing. Okay, so for the disciplinary areas, we have a lot of people publishing in the humanities, and 25% publishing in social sciences, 17% in education, and 17% in science and engineering. That's great because we can see a nice range, which is very helpful for a workshop on variation across disciplines. That's right. Some of you may have changed fields. Some of you may work across different disciplines. You're probably already kind of aware or very aware how the writing changes as we move across disciplines. Okay, and then the second area was how many years have you been publishing? And it looks like 25% have been publishing for 0 to 2 years, so are newer to that area. About half have published for 3 to 6 years, 8% 7 to 10 years, and a quarter of you all have published for 11 or more years. So you have a lot of experience. As you likely know, even within a discipline, we might find variation in how people write on different topic areas or subfields of a discipline. We have public health, and that is another thing that I'm going to hope to give you tools for looking at, just even within a discipline, even within a journal. Okay, this is great. Thank you so much for sharing that because it is really helpful for me as we move forward. Okay, so I'd like to move to kind of introducing what I mean by disciplinary variation or disciplinary preferences in writing. So we have just another poll, just a little kind of quiz. Which discipline do you think is more likely to include a description of methods in a journal article abstract? So that, abstract at the beginning, do you think philosophy is more likely to include their methods or physics? 9% said philosophy and 91% said physics. And the answer is physics. And in fact, it's 62% of physics article abstracts include a method section, and only 7% of abstracts for philosophy articles include a method section. And we'll talk in a little bit about why that might be. Okay, next one. So another area that we can find differences in is not just what we include about our research, but also how we talk about other sources. So this little quiz comes from a study of book reviews. So book reviews, of course, review a book in your discipline, and they evaluate it sometimes, right? They might praise the strengths of the book, or they might describe some of the weaknesses of the book, offering criticism. So I have 3 disciplines listed here: electrical engineering, philosophy, and sociology. And for each one in the poll should give you the chance for each one to choose whether you think the field includes more praise or more criticism in their book reviews. So electrical engineers, you all were kind of split. So about 54% of you said they probably include more praise, and 46% said more criticism. So not sure there amongst the group. The next one, philosophy, 46% of you said probably more praise, and 54%, so slightly more, said probably more criticism in the book reviews. And then our last area, sociology, 38% of you said they probably include more praise, but 62% of you said they probably include more criticism. So uncertainty. Let's look at the actual results from this research study, which found that electrical engineering book reviews, 77% of the book reviews had more praise and 23% more criticism. So praise is more common in electrical engineering book reviews. But in the other 2 fields, you can see it's not a big split. There's quite a nice balance between praise and criticism, but there's actually more critique, more negative evaluation of the books. And so this is kind of interesting because it tells us that disciplines don't just write differently in the forms that they use, but also in how they talk about other research and other people's work. So it's an interesting kind of rhetorical difference that we see there. Okay, I have another one here. One study in research writing has looked at reporting verbs, which are these verbs that I'm sure are very familiar to you all, that describe what another source did or what the present source did. So we have things like this paper describes, or findings suggest. And again, it can be describing your own paper or the work of others. And if you look at the most common reporting verbs across disciplines, we see that they are in some ways similar. A lot of them use describe, for example, or suggest. But we also see some differences. So, for example, in biology, show is a very common reporting verb, but not in a lot of these others. Epidemiology uses examine very commonly. We don't see that in the others. Nursing uses demonstrate and observe, which we don't see as a common verb in the others. And applied linguistics commonly uses argue and also explain. We don't see argue in any of these other fields as common reporting verbs. Do you have any guesses about why we might see these trends? Why might they use different vocabulary to describe what other sources are doing, or what their own, for these reporting verbs? Difference in the methods used. Different types of evidence. Yes, absolutely. They deal with different processes, different research processes for sure. They're examining or observing, arguing, right? And that's very different to argue something versus to observe something. Good. And different types of research questions. Absolutely. So, and the goals can be different. So I love these responses because you're really getting at why the writing is different is, again, not just accidental, but it's because the disciplines are different. The way that they do research, the way that they construct knowledge is different. That's excellent. Okay, and then this example I just find very fun. These are common adjectives to describe good, average, or poor work in different disciplines. And you can see in the humanities, common adjectives for describing good work are scholarly or original. In social sciences, good work might be described as perceptive or rigorous. And in physics, good work is often described as elegant or economical. Those are very, very different evaluative adjectives, right, to describe strong scholarship. You can see average work, sound is very common in the humanities. Does that sound familiar to those of you who work in the humanities? Do you see that adjective as describing average work? It's sound. Social sciences might describe average work as scholarly. And in physics, we find accurate as a common adjective to describe average work. And then I think the adjectives for poor work are quite funny. So in the humanities, it might be thin. In the social sciences, it's anecdotal, right? It's not systematic. It's just an example. And in physics, sloppy could be a way to describe poor work. So again, we see these reflect the values of the discipline, the way that we understand knowledge, the way that we evaluate knowledge, and the way that we practice research. I hope those might seem a little familiar to you. Maybe you can spot where your discipline might fall there. Okay, so why do we see these differences, right? So we know that there's a different way to write across fields. We can think of this as a kind of cross-cultural variation. And I wanted to share this diagram because I think it's a really useful way to think about culture. So it's actually from an article by a researcher, Dwight Atkinson, who has tried to understand what culture means especially in teaching languages. And so the diagram is specific to teaching, but we can take away from the diagram a lot just about research writing. So the idea here is instead of just thinking of big monolithic cultures, Russian culture, American culture, Japanese culture, that in fact, we instead work within smaller cultures that overlap and intersect. So there are national cultures, but there's also professional academic cultures. There's institutional cultures. There might even be, there's subfield cultures, right? So some areas, like in my discipline of applied linguistics, people who do second language acquisition are a slightly different subculture than people who focus on classroom teaching in their research, the way they talk about things, the way they do their research. So if you can think about these overlapping cultures that you work within in your academic environment, those are all influencing and shaping the ways that we write and the preferences for writing within your discipline, within your subfield, and even within particular journals that you might be publishing in. Does that make sense to see it as a kind of cultural variation? And cultures are messy, right? So variation is also not predictable. There's always going to be variation even within our little small cultures. If we think about it this way, we can see academic texts as embodying our disciplinary approaches. Again, those kind of cultural ways that specifically we construct knowledge. So how do we know something in our field? And then how do we share that knowledge? Those are cultural practices. So you can think about your own field, for example. Is knowledge constructed through observing something? In your field, do you know something by going, watching it, collecting data on it, and maybe doing statistics of your data, or perhaps coding and analyzing your data, right? That's one way to construct knowledge. Or perhaps you work in a field that uses what people might call hermeneutic inquiry, where you interpret. Maybe you look at texts, either written texts or broadly sort of cultural texts, and you interpret those texts in a more subjective manner. Those are very different approaches to knowledge construction, and they absolutely influence the way that we write about our research. Also think about your discipline. Do you discover facts in your discipline? Is that what research does? Or do you construct an understanding or a truth, kind of in scare quotes, about what's happening? And different fields approach that very differently. You can also think about whether a researcher in your field is supposed to be neutral as they approach their research and their data or the area of inquiry, and objective, or conversely, do you consider the researcher as part of the process of constructing knowledge, as an active participant in the research? And even again, within a discipline, there may be some differences there. All right, and I want to just show an example of how this gets reflected in research writing. So what I have on this slide are two abstracts. You don't need to read the abstracts, don't worry. But they are taken from, the first one is taken from Applied Linguistics, and it's a study, a quantitative research study looking at language learning and pronunciation. And I've just underlined some of the phrases from the beginning and the end. So you can see the abstract begins with, this study examined how mode of input affects the learning of pronunciation. And then at the end of the abstract, we have, taken together, the findings suggest that simultaneous presentation of written and spoken forms is optimal. So these are maybe relatively neutral, right? There's no personal pronouns. They use that examined. The findings suggest. It's very different from the second abstract, which is taken from the journal Cultural Inquiry, so a cultural studies discipline, where we see the abstract begin with, this article argues against, right? That's quite different from this study examined. So it says right off, I'm taking a position, I'm going to argue something, not search for the answer. And then the abstract ends with, the article concludes by, so it's quite different. Again, it concludes by reflecting, different from the findings suggest, right? So if we compare these two disciplines, we see, or these two abstracts, we see a different approach to sharing knowledge and a different position of the researcher, and that's reflected in how they write. So just a couple of little things before we dive in a little more. So we've looked at, discipline as a big shaper of how we write. I also want to just acknowledge that there are other aspects that shape how the writing might vary from article to article, or from different settings. So one is genre. So the type of writing that you're doing will also shape the choices that you make in the writing and the preferences that your discipline has. So for example, if you're writing a grant proposal, you might make different choices than when you're writing a research article, right? Or a book review. So the purpose of writing, the audience of writing, the context, all will shape the choices that we make. And then of course, there's individual differences. So there are aspects of you as a writer, maybe your position in the field. Are you a known expert? Are you a newcomer? Are you very confident in the research area? Maybe you're newer to the research area and you want to be a bit more hesitant. Are you a bold researcher, a critical researcher? Perhaps what is your background culturally that might influence your writing? So all of these things come into play. So we will focus on disciplinary variation, but I just want to acknowledge that that's not the only thing that's shaping our writing. Okay, so with that said, we're going to focus on 3 areas to look at more specifically what variation might look like across disciplines, and to think about how this variation might impact your own writing. So the 3 areas are first person pronouns, which of course are like I, me, my, or we, us, and our. We'll also look at citations, including the frequency of citations and also the kind of style of citations. I'll introduce the terms integral and non-integral when we get to that section. And then the third area we'll look at are called rhetorical moves. So these are the different functions of different parts of a paper, and that can vary a lot by discipline. So I'll explain that more when we get there. So we're going to start with the first person pronouns, which are one of the more common areas of variation and maybe more recognizable. All right, so I have two texts here that are actually the same text that I've just revised a little bit to point out some differences in reporting conclusions. So on the left side of your screen, you see the conclusion is stated as our analysis establishes that many large US employers exhibit nationwide patterns of racial discrimination that are temporally and spatially stable. This is from an economics journal. That same sentence on the right side of your screen is reworded just a little bit differently. So instead of our analysis, it says this analysis, and the rest of the sentence is the same. And then the second sentence, a similar variation. So on the left side, you see it says, we estimate that 20% of firms, and so on. And on the right side, it is estimated that. Okay, so just comparing these, what do you think? And again, you can use the chat if you'd like it, or you can unmute. What is the different effect of these two ways of reporting conclusions? And I like someone already noted, Yevgeny, not sure how to describe it, but the second article seems to be more persuasive, where the first was rather investigative. The difference seems to be unrelated to fields of inquiry. Yeah, this is just me messing with a text to show how it might make a difference in how you read it. One on the right sounds, as you said, Yevgeny, maybe like you can find the data, you can reproduce the same study. It seems more impersonal, seems more objective. I really like the comment that when a writer is a famous expert, we and our refer to a personal responsibility for results and estimations. That's really interesting. Using our, we, authors acknowledge their contribution, right? So there's a difference between we did this, we estimate, versus this analysis shows it is estimated. I really like this idea of the authors taking responsibility, and we see the author's role in the left side. So it's not just a tiny little stylistic difference. It seems to suggest or reflect a way of thinking about how research is carried out, right? What is good research? So I really love the comments because they absolutely identify that. And again, this was from a journal of economics. I actually believe the one on the left was the original, which I thought was quite interesting. But also note that this is a study that's looking at racial discrimination from an economic perspective. And it may be sometimes that the topics within a research area, there's more preference or less preference for kind of inserting the author into the process of knowledge construction. So what I'd like to do next is give you a chance to think through what this looks like in your field. And I have a list of questions for you to discuss the discipline or disciplines that you publish in, how common you think personal first-person pronouns are in the writing in your field. If they are used, where are they used? So are they used, for example, in the methodology? Are they used in the findings section? Are they used in the conclusion section? If they are not used, why do you think they are not used? Are they sort of actively discouraged in your field, and why is that? And then also, can you connect these preferences to the ways that your discipline constructs knowledge? Is there a relationship there? Have you all ever heard of the royal we? So it doesn't mean we, the researchers, it means us all together in the field, right? So there's definitely an influence of whether it's collaborative writing and co-authored writing, but there also are some disciplines, and math is the most common example. And I think Yevgeny wrote, it's like a teacher might say to the student, well, first we do this, and then we do this. And it means sort of us as a group. So, right, different disciplines have different ways of constructing knowledge and therefore may make use of the royal we or the collaborative, we are a research team carrying out the work. A sort of quick takeaway from this little section is that, go back to your field and look at the use of first person in your discipline. And again, does it vary by subfield? Does it vary by the topic? Does it vary by the journal? Again, the editors may have preferences. In my field, there are some journals that use personal pronouns much more than other journals. And then again, look also at when they're used, or where in a paper, if they are used, to what extent their usage might signal a particular approach to knowledge construction, and also to what extent it might in fact impact the personality of the text, how we read the text and how we read the author. So you have choices for sure, but you want to make your choices based on what you're seeing in the trends in writing in your field. We're going to look a little bit at citations now. So I actually have a citation in the slide, right? A study by Highland, that's a kind of citation, looked at the frequency of citations in journal articles. So he looked across 8 disciplines. He looked at 30 research articles in each discipline and looked at the number of citations that appear in an article on average. So I've given you 4 possible orders of most to least frequent citation usage by discipline. And I see there's a question, citation as a link or as a part of a text. So either way, any mention of a source, it could be a footnote, it could be something like this example here, a study by Highland. So it might just be a number, it might be a parentheses, but any kind of citation. So we're just thinking of how many times sources are cited, not how they're cited at this point. And you can choose the order that you think was his finding. Was it A, with biology as the most frequent citations and philosophy is the least frequent? B, you have sociology and marketing at the top and engineering and physics at the bottom. C, with philosophy and sociology at the top, engineering and physics at the bottom, and D, marketing at the top and applied linguistics at the bottom. So 30% of you thought it was option A, with biology and physics as the most frequent citers and philosophy is the least. Nobody chose B. 60% of you chose option C. So thinking philosophy was at the top and physics at the bottom. And 10% chose option D, with marketing at the top and applied linguistics at the bottom. I think I would have chosen C if I didn't know the result, because I would just assume philosophy would be at the top. But you might be surprised that, in fact, it's the one that nobody chose. So you can see the data. And I really like this table because you can see the data in different ways. So he looked at the average number of citations per paper and also per 1,000 words. So it's normed, right? Because papers are different lengths. And then the total number of citations. So sociology was way up there as using the most number of citations, and physics was at the bottom with the least number of citations. Any surprise? Was anybody surprised? I know there were some sociologists in the group. A lot of nodding. Yeah, I'm really surprised philosophy is not at the top. I kind of thought that would be the most frequently cited. And I also was a little surprised to see biology up there, right? It's quite different from physics, for example. So they're both sciences, but they construct knowledge differently. And we see a pretty different citation pattern between the two. Yeah, Evgeny, you were split between B and C. So you had a 50% chance. They're pretty, I mean, the B and C were pretty similar. All right, so that's one way to think about citation is just how much do you cite, right? And you can see that there can be a lot of variation, broadly speaking, across disciplines in just how much we cite. There's also differences in citation systems. If you use, for example, APA documentation style versus MLA documentation style, APA encourages a lot more citation than MLA does. Yeah, and marketing I was surprised marketing also, that really did surprise me that marketing is so high up there. Okay, so just the number of citations is one area, but we can also find variation in how different disciplines cite sources. So we can cite sources in at least 4 ways. And one is a quotation. So you can see an example here. While Birkenkotter and Hucken's scientist subject sought to gain acceptance for original and significant work, the reviewers insisted, quote, that to be science, her report had to include an intertextual framework to her local knowledge. So it actually includes a quotation. We can also include longer quotations, which are called block quotes. So usually it depends on the style, but something like 40 or more words, you, instead of putting the quotation marks around it, you indent it, and it's called a block quote. Okay, so those are 2 ways to cite sources, but there's also summaries. So a summary would be just summarizing, the main finding of one text. So Bazerman found that blah, blah, blah. Actually, you might find this summary interesting. Bazerman found that the number of items in reference lists had risen steadily last century, from 1.5 per article in Physical Review in 1910 to more than 25 in 1980. So we see changes over time as well, as we were mentioning with pronouns. And we also use citations to just make generalizations based on multiple sources. So the example here says the historical research on scientific texts has demonstrated the gradual emergence of the discussion section to replace methods as the dominant basis of persuasion. And then we have 3 sources in the parentheses. So that's a generalization. Okay, so those are at least 4 ways that we can cite sources. So another poll for you, which of these approaches to incorporating sources do you think is most common in published research writing overall? So not thinking about discipline, just in general, if we look at academic published writing, which is the most common? To quote, to include a block quote, to summarize, or to generalize? All right, so 1 vote for quote, 1 vote for block quote, 3 votes for summary, and 5 votes for generalization. So generalization was your guess, the most common guess to be the most common way that we cite sources. And in fact, it's summary. So the mention of a summary of one particular source. Do you think that varies by discipline though? Or do you think that's true across disciplines? Let's have a look. So here's the data. We can see, yeah, maybe vary by genre, absolutely varies by genre. So we can see quotes and block quotes are pretty rare overall. And they're very rare in sciences and engineering, to the extent that they did not even appear in the collection of texts that were analyzed in this study, which again was 30 articles per discipline. They're used, but still pretty rare as we get into the social sciences and humanities. And block quotes are rarer than quotes. But look at summaries, super, super common. And generalizations for most fields are, they're still used pretty frequently, about a third or a quarter of citations or generalizations. Interestingly, philosophy is quite rare for generalizations. And we can think of, about why that might be. They might be focused much more on individual philosophers rather than making broad general claims. So I'm going to dig in a little bit more. So we have the block, the quotes, the summaries, and the generalizations. Another really interesting variation that we see is what we can call the surface forms of citation. And I think some of you were kind of asking about this earlier. So do we cite in parentheses or with a footnote, or do we put the author's name in the text? And so these forms where we put the author's name in the text, these are called integral citations. You don't need to remember them, and you really don't need them long-term. Just the idea, I think, is really useful, that there is a difference between putting the scholar, the source, in the main sentence versus offsetting it in a parentheses or a footnote. So integral citations put the source in the sentence. So Bazerman, 1988, found. The other kinds of citations, again, we take it out of the sentence. It's kind of extra information. So you can compare these two sentences. Bazerman found that the number of items in reference lists had risen steadily, versus the number of items in reference lists has risen steadily this century. And then we get the parentheses, the non-integral citation. So those are giving a very different style, right? Whether we include the scholar in the sentence, or the scholar themselves is not as important, the name of the person is not as important, we just put it off at the end of the sentence. And I'm guessing that you can see this different effect in the same way that we can see with pronoun usage or passive voice, that there's a rhetorical effect, right? Probably a lot of fields do use both. But people in my field like to look at, well, how much do they use both? What's the balance, right? Do they use more of one? All right, so Mishik says non-integral for sure. Like maybe it's much, much more common. All right, so balance. Well, here's the data. So you can see if you are in the hard sciences, you probably are seeing much more use of non-integral citations. And even as we get into the social sciences, we still have more use of the non-integral, but we see an increased number of integral. About a third of the citations might be integral. And then philosophy is our outlier here, right? So philosophy is mostly integral citations and about a third non-integral. So that probably holds true in a lot of humanities disciplines, that there are maybe more use of integral citations compared to non-integral citations. And it fits in this case with what we saw about philosophy, right? Focusing on individual scholars. So you might be more likely to include that individual scholar in your actual text. Okay, I have a couple other, we'll get even more detailed here. So integral citations we can carry out in different ways as well. So the first example is when we put the name of the scholar or scholars, could be co-authors, as the subject of a sentence. It's really prominent here, right? We're really focused on that person. Bazerman found. But I bet you've also seen the second example where we can call it a non-subject position. So according to Bazerman, the number of items has risen steadily. And again, it has a slightly different effect. It's maybe not emphasizing the author as much, but it still does emphasize the author, the other scholar. And then we have these interesting noun phrase integral citations. So note in the following discussion, I also adopt Thompson and Yee's useful convention of referring to the person, right? We can even sometimes make a name into an adjective, right? Like Gracian maxims. So if someone's really famous, they might become an adjective. But all of these are examples of integrals, different ways that you can write an integral citation. You can put the subject as the subject of the sentence, the scholar as the subject of the sentence. You can use these phrases like according to, or you can actually turn them into a noun phrase. I see a question in the chat. Does this choice have to do with result certainty, whether the research question is answered conclusively or in an it depends manner? Perhaps, right? How it might be that if it seems very conclusive, you only want to focus on the finding, so you don't put the scholar's name in that sentence. If you put the scholar's name, it does tie the result to the author. So it might have to do with, well, this person found this, but we don't know if everybody would find this. So I think that's a really very astute observation, right? That there's a different effect when we put that name in. It might be a kind of hedging in a way. I want to look at how these different integral citations look across fields. So the subject position, like in marketing, the subject position is very common. You can see 67% of these integral citations take the form of the source being in the subject position. But let's compare, for example, engineering, where most of the integral citations put the name of the scholar as in the non-subject position, according to blah, blah, blah. And very few use the noun phrase. But look at philosophy again, it's very evenly distributed. So we can see a lot of differences across the disciplines here. And again, like marketing, applied linguistics and sociology, these more social science fields really seem to like that subject position. Bazerman found that. I've given you a paragraph with some citations. This is taken from an article that looked at student course evaluations and whether if you give them cookies while they're evaluating your teaching, do they give you higher course evaluations or not? The answer is yes. In fact, it did have a difference. And these were chocolate chip cookies, I think was the key. Okay, so in the example here, it's all integral citations. What I'd like you to do is try to rewrite part of that paragraph, but I'd like you to introduce some variation into it, maybe some non-integral citations where you think it would be appropriate. And if you want, you can also consider the practices of your field. But the key is just how could we vary some of these citations? I think a key is seeing how it changes the style of the text. And again, what becomes prominent and what becomes less important, right? What is the source name important or is it less important? And I see a question in the chat, is it allowed to quote both in the text and according to one of the major styles in text, like as Shkolnikov et al. Stated? Oh yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on your documentation style that you're using, whether you can, if you do that as Shkolnikov et al. Stated, would you also put the parenthetical citation at the end? It might depend on the documentation style. That's a very good question. I'm going to show how I revised that. I was looking, I think the initials IF, I'm not sure which participant it is, but I think you did exactly what I did, which doesn't mean it's the correct answer. But I was just, again, like you were doing, trying to play with how could we vary it? Which citations would I probably change? And I thought, well, I might keep the according to Sporin et al. Because, you know, it's kind of a different style. And so it gives the text a little diversity. I would keep Mezek's 1995 Unified Conceptualization of Validity, because that seems to want to make that author visible, right? Like it's their conceptualization of validity. But I would probably make the next set a parenthetical non-integral citation. Various frameworks have been introduced to assess the validity of SETs. And then because I have two sources, just put it in a non-integral citation or a footnote if your discipline uses footnotes. And then the other area, I don't know how many of you were able to get to the end of the paragraph, but here they're giving all of these examples. This is a kind of typical literature review, right, of previous research. And because there's so many different studies, it's kind of awkward to make them all integral citations. So the non-integral actually works much better here. So for example, several trials have investigated the influence of teaching effectiveness on teaching effectiveness of other factors, including course subject, non-integral citation, class size, non-integral citation. Again, this is a generalization. We have multiple sources, much easier to put it off from the sentence. Instructor attractiveness and gender. So all of those are put in those non-integral positions. There's a question, is it acceptable to write? Yeah, see, for example, absolutely. And again, that might depend on the discipline. In my discipline, that's pretty common to say, see, for example, these sources. Absolutely. There is some difficulty, like if you put all of these citations at the end of this sentence, so if you said including course subject, class size, instructor attentiveness, and gender, and then you put like a footnote to all of those, or you said, see, for example, all of those studies, there's a little bit of a problem in that readers don't know which source studied which thing. So that is something to be aware of if you put them all at the end. It's easier to read if they're all at the end, for sure. But that is, it becomes ambiguous which source goes with which study. Okay, so just so we can get to our last area, some quick takeaways from the citation. I think the key here is just to be aware that there is variation. There's different preferences across disciplines, across genre, and perhaps across journals. So really look into what patterns you're seeing in your discipline and your area of research. Citations are really important because they're the way we connect to other scholarship. So do we show the individuals whose work we're basing our work off of, or do we show the general area of work that we're building off of, or a balance of those, and what kind of balance? So look through published writing in your discipline, look at these kinds of variations for integral, for non-integral, subject position, non-subject position, and so on. And you also might want to look at how much variation. So in the text that I gave you, in fact, the original text that I took it from, it uses footnotes, and all of the citations, except for the Mezek's Unified Conceptualization of Validity, everything else is a non-integral citation in the original text. So in that particular area, there's not a lot of variation, but I would recommend looking into your research area and seeing what authors are doing and what options you have. Okay, let's move to our last area. This is actually my very favorite because I find it so empowering as a writer to see these kinds of trends. And again, they do vary across discipline, but this is a really nice tool for you to look at another type of variation, which is called rhetorical moves. I put that in the chat as well. And we're going to look at rhetorical moves, particularly in introductions. So a move is just a part of a text that has a particular function. It's trying to do something for the reader. It's not labeled. It's not like a heading, like methods, discussion, results. It is a non-labeled part of a text. It could be a sentence. It could be a paragraph. It could be a collection of sentences. But that part of the text is trying to do something for the reader. And research has found that there's 3 really common moves in article introductions in academic writing. And you may be familiar with this from some of the other workshops that you've done. But the 3 very common moves are, first, establishing a research territory. And authors do this in different ways. Sometimes they might show that the research area is important, that it's central, that it's interesting, it's relevant. This seems to be kind of optional. But they also, another thing that they do is they introduce and review previous research in the area. Again, this is only in the introduction section of a paper. And this seems to be required to actually introduce and cite some previous research in the area. But either of these are called steps, A and B. They help us establish that there's research out there in the area of our paper. So we call that establishing the research territory. The second move that we see commonly in introductions is called establishing a niche, or like a little space, right? And this seems to be a required move in most disciplines. And it is where we indicate that there's a gap in previous research, or that we're going to extend previous knowledge in some way. So we have to show that there's a purpose for our paper, right? So that the editors and the reviewers think it's important. And the way that authors do this is they establish this gap or this need for what we are writing about. And then the third common move is often called occupying the niche. So we've created this space. There's a lack of research in this area. And then we say, this paper will look at this area. So that's taking that niche, occupying the niche. And authors can do this in different ways. A very common way is to outline the purposes of your paper or state the nature of your research. It's so common that some people say this is required. There's always variation though, so I'm always nervous about saying it's required. Another thing that authors do is they list their research questions or their hypothesis at the end of the introduction often. You may do this in your discipline. They might announce their findings. This is very variable by discipline. Some disciplines do not announce findings at the beginning. They can state the value of the present research, say how important it is. And they can also indicate the structure of the article. So first, this paper will blah, blah, blah. Then it will blah, 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 right? That little roadmap. Okay, so these are common moves. How the author can excuse that not all the work in the field are covered for now. Yeah, so that, how we can say not everything has been done, that's establishing the niche. That's there's a, maybe previous studies didn't look at blah, 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 or maybe their methodology wasn't strong enough. So this is another area that's really useful for writing, right? But it also has some variation. So I want to just first do a quick look at an abstract that does use these moves. I'm going to read it out loud just so we're all at the same pace. And as I do that, and just see if you can identify where move 1 might be, where move 2 might be, and where move 3 might be. Okay, so when I read it, I'm not going to read the citations. All right, this is an article about spam. We all get spam in our email. This person actually analyzed spam. So again, you're looking for that. Where do they establish the research territory? Where do they indicate a gap or a niche? And where do they occupy the niche? Okay, so spam can be defined as unsolicited email, usually promotional, sent out to multiple recipients. On a more detailed level, a differentiation is made between unsolicited bulk email and unsolicited commercial email, UBE and UCE. UBE is a hypernym and UCE a hyponym, which excludes non-commercial emails, such as, for instance, chain emails. The spam analyzed in the present paper is UCE. Unsolicited promotional emails are the focus of interest. Spam has fast become a familiar figure in the inbox of email users, accounting for approximately 60% of all internet traffic. Despite this, however, linguistic analyses of spam email represent a research desideratum, means a gap. Employing genre analysis, the present paper attempts to meet this research gap by conducting a genre analysis of unsolicited promotional emails. After a short synopsis of the approach taken to genre analysis, there follows a short summary of the state of the art on promotional emails from a linguistic point of view. Oh, I think I repeated that. A brief description of spam focusing on communicative purpose and also an overview of the specific rhetorical context of spam email is then given. Following this, the corpus for analysis consisting of 121 unsolicited promotional emails written in English posted online by online medical suppliers over a period of 8 weeks is introduced. Notice the passive voice. The investigation itself focuses on the macro-textual level of analysis. Okay, so did you see move 1? Does it start by establishing a territory? First paragraph? Absolutely, it's giving us the citations, right? That's showing that there's research out there. This is a problem. This is an issue that should be addressed. Great. Do you see move 2? It doesn't start at the beginning of the paragraph. It actually starts right there. Despite this, however, linguistic analysis represent a research desideratum. There is no research on this, right? That's the gap. Okay. And what about the occupying the niche, move 3? The present paper attempts to meet this research gap by conducting a genre analysis. So I color coded it here for you. So the establishing a niche is just that one sentence. It's like super important rhetorical move, but it's really short, right? But it tells us there's a hole here and my research is going to address that hole. Yeah, move 1 seems to only be present indirectly by citing a definition rather than constructing one themselves. That's right. They're just sort of saying, here's an area of research. They're not actively constructing that area. That's a good point. So this is just one example. Again, there's variation, and that's what I want to explore a little bit with you all. These are some areas where there's variation, are these different steps. So I'm wondering for you all in your research, do you think it's very common to show that the general research area is important, central, interesting, problematic, or relevant? Do you think that's a common step, which is part of move 1 in your field? Seems like we have a lot of yeses so far. Great. Okay, you can erase that one. No no's, I saw. And what about that 1B? In your field, do you think it's common to introduce and review items of previous research in the area as part of your introduction? I'm glad to hear that there's variation because, again, this is often presented as everybody does this, but that's not the case. There is a lot of variation in what different fields will do. Okay, what about move 2? Indicating a gap in the previous research or extending previous knowledge. So in your field, is it common to do this in the introduction? Yeah. Any no's? If you're not sure, it's something to look for. And it's really useful once you start noticing it, you see these phrases that people typically use to indicate some kind of a gap. But that is the most common move. Okay, let's look at move 3. So this is where we see a lot of variation. So in your field, do articles tend to outline the purpose or the nature of the paper? So something like this paper examines, or this paper argues. We have one yes, couple yeses, bunch of yeses. I'm wondering if any don't do that. It seems like a pretty common move. Okay, what about 3B? In your introduction, is it common in your field to list research questions or hypotheses? Even in my field, I find a lot of variation in whether research questions are included in the introduction. It seems like in some papers they are, and in some they don't come until either the end of the literature review or even in the methodology. What about principal findings? Do you think introductions in your field share findings in the introduction? Yeah. What about this next one? Stating the value of the present research. Is that common? This is important because, or this paper contributes to. It's really useful if you think, like if your reviewers say, we can't see how this is important, use this because that will make it very, very clear. This is important because, right, you're persuading your readers of the value of the research. And then the last move, indicating the structure of the article. So that little like map of the paper. I have a colleague who he loves that little structure of the article. And if his graduate students don't include it, he makes them include it. So some readers really want it. And in some fields or some journals, some editors may not want it. It seems there's a lot of preference in that. And perhaps the length of the article also influences this. In a shorter article with a very predictable structure, you may not use that. But in a long article with an unpredictable structure, it might be really important. You can't find a not sure reaction. I know, we need that, right? Or it depends. Sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. There's individual preference. I think especially in that last one. This is our last little exercise to kind of get familiar with these moves a little bit. And I'm glad that you have some of you might have some experience with the moves all the time already. So I've given you an introduction that is jumbled up. It's a kind of a satire article. They did a test of whether you will die or not die if you jump out of a plane with a parachute or not having a parachute, but they only jumped like 5 feet. So nobody died in this experiment. But anyway, it gives us a nice example of an introduction. And it's mixed up. So what I'd like you to do, oh, somebody's seen it, good. I'd like you to try to reassemble it into what you think makes sense, using that fairly predictable move structure. So what you're going to do is take those numbers for each section and just try to figure out what order should the sentences all go in. And you can just write your new order in the chat. So for example, if you think number 2 is the first sentence, is the best first sentence in the introduction, you'll put 2, and then maybe you think 4 would go after that. So you're just going to try to reconstruct the order. Does anyone have good guesses for what might be the first sentence of this introduction? Right, parachutes are routinely used to prevent death or major traumatic injury. So it's often that first sentence is quite general, tells us what the topic area is. Where do you see establishing a niche? So 5 is actually occupying the gap, right? To address these important gaps. It's despite is like such a good little, warning, like, the gap is coming. Despite this widely held unsubstantiated belief of efficacy, many studies have suggested blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we've got that. So that's actually, there's also another one that's, let's see, that shows a real, like, studies have not been done. Yeah, a false direction. I really like that label. It is. It's sort of like a preliminary gap. Number 3 is a preliminary gap. But look at number 2. Previous attempts to evaluate parachute use have not been undertaken in a randomized setting, owing to ethical and practical concerns. So it's saying we haven't done research on this yet. So that's a real gap. Okay, so here, this is actually the actual order. So 4 was the first. So 4 followed by 3 followed by 6. And then we get this gap in 2 and 1. And then we get the occupying the gap in 5. And I'll just show you. But I also want to point out that there's these sort of mini indicating a gap points in earlier during the established territory, right? However, evidence is weak. So we get this like hint that, all right, there's work there, but, and then we get more information. Notice the establishing territory uses the citations. We have non-integral citations here. And then we get the more obvious indicating a gap. Previous attempts have not been undertaken. Lack of equipoise could inhibit recruitment of participants. And then we get the occupying. To address these important gaps in evidence, we conducted blah, blah, blah. So that is a fairly standard and fairly typical short introduction. But the moves, there is variation in that there's these like kind of small gap moves at the beginning as well. And I also want to point out that this is a quite short introduction. It's the one on the left. It's only 2 paragraphs. And on the right, you can see, this is from my field, a very long introduction. So it's about almost 2 pages in length. And the longer the introduction, the more variation we tend to see in those move patterns, right? Especially a repetition of establishing territory and indicating a gap, and then establishing more territory and indicating a gap. So those 2 moves might become kind of repetitive and kind of cycle through. All right. So I hope that that's useful. The takeaways for this last little part are to look at those moves and introductions and think through the variations in how those moves might be used in your field. I would also consider subfield, topic, journal, individual writer, and maybe even language background and how people use moves. And look at the length and look at how much work is cited and how that affects the use of those different rhetorical moves. So I think of that as just a tool that, again, you can take to look at the work in your field and decide what are the common ways to do introductions and what are some options that I have as a writer to vary them. Thank you, everybody.